Hello everyone, Pastor Todd here. Great to be with you all and welcome back to our series on overcoming fear and anxiety. Today we're going to be talking about Psalm 23, which is quite possibly the most well-known psalm in the entire book. Psalm 23 has meant so much to so many people throughout history, and it's given people hope in times of hopelessness. It's been present with people at the end of their lives and there for families as they've gathered to remember and celebrate the life of a loved one. It's such a powerful psalm with such beautiful imagery that fills us with hope in who God is and His goodness and provision in our lives. I want to share with you an exercise that I practice in my life. I have this practice at times, especially when I'm feeling overwhelmed by fear and or anxiety, of stopping, of pausing and closing my eyes and trying to go back to a memory of a time when I felt God's presence, a time when I was surrounded by God's beauty in creation and God's beauty in the lives of loved ones around me. Oftentimes those memories include nature, they often include friends, family, loved ones in my life. And I go back to remember God's faithfulness and to give thanks to Him. Even when things in my life feel unsettled in the moment, I can go back to these points in my story and remember how God was present and how God showed Himself to me. And so because of this practice, these days I tend to pay closer attention to experiences when I'm in them that I feel surrounded by God's goodness and God's presence in my life. As an example, a few weeks ago, we were out on Cape Cod celebrating my wife's birthday. And we stayed at this really cool house in East Orleans, just a little ways away from Nauset Beach. During our time there, we'd often, as a family, walk out to Nauset Beach, and the path leading us to the beach was this really cool path that had a wooden walkway that went over the marsh and then led out to the sand of Nauset Beach. One day, as we were walking out that way to go play in the waves and enjoy some family time on the sand, I felt myself just aware of God's goodness and His presence in our lives. And I stopped for a moment and paused at the beginning of that wooden walkway and watched as the kids ran on ahead of me, full of joy and delight, running toward the waves of the ocean. I smelled the smell of the marsh and the salt air around me. I heard the waves crashing on the shore, and I heard the breeze blowing through the tall grasses in the marsh. It was a beautiful moment where God felt present, and I could soak in these experiences and give thanks to God for His goodness in my life. Psalm 23 is like that. David is the author of Psalm 23, and if you recall from his story, David as a youth was a shepherd. He spent time in the wilderness tending to the flock that was under his care. And I imagine that during that season of David's life, he experienced the presence of God as he slept out under the stars. He experienced the provision of God as God empowered him with courage and with strength to fight off the lions and the bears that came against the sheep under his care. And now David is at a different point in his life. David's a king, and he's been through some serious life experiences, great highs and low lows. David's had great victories, but he's also had significant defeats. He's had people who've wanted to kill him. He spent time hiding in the wilderness out of fear for his life. But now at this point in his life, David, kind of like I do in that exercise, I think is going back to those early memories of his life as a shepherd and how God showed up during those times. David's experiences echo the experiences of St. Patrick, who, if you recall from St. Patrick's story, he was taken from Britain and brought to Ireland, where he spent some time as a slave. And as a slave, one of his responsibilities was to care for the sheep and the pigs out in the hills. And Patrick, like David, spent nights outside under the stars. In his confessions, Patrick talks about his prayer time in the wilderness as he served as a shepherd. He writes, "I used to stay out in the forests and on the mountain, and I would wake up before daylight to pray. in the snow, in icy coldness, in rain. And I used to feel neither ill nor any slothfulness, because as I now see, the Spirit was burning in me at that time. And I imagine that, at least to a small degree, it was that time that Patrick spent in God's presence in the wilderness that compelled him to return to the land of Ireland and share the message of Jesus with those who had formerly enslaved him. And so in Psalm 23, David's doing a similar thing. He's remembering what his experiences were like as a shepherd, but now he's turning the tables and putting himself in the place of the sheep and identifying God as the good shepherd. Let's hear David's words together from Psalm 23. David writes, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." And in these 6 short verses, David expresses a multitude of images and powerful statements about God's character. People have been reflecting on this psalm since the time it was written, and certainly in our Christian tradition, we've continued to meditate on and reflect on these words and incorporate them into our lives and draw strength from them in distinct moments when we felt fear or anxiety or sorrow or grief. The 19th century Congregationalist pastor Henry Ward Beecher said the following about Psalm 23. He writes, "It has charmed more griefs to rest than all the philosophy of the world. It has remanded to their dungeon more felon thoughts, more black doubts, more thieving sorrows than there are sands on the seashore. It has comforted the noble host of the poor. It has sung courage to the army of the disappointed. It has poured balm and consolation into the heart of the sick, of captives in dungeons, of widows in their pinching griefs, of orphans in their loneliness. Dying soldiers have died easier as it was read to them. Ghastly hospitals have been illuminated. It has visited the prisoner and broken his chains, and like Peter's angel, led him forth in imagination and sung him back to his home again. It has made the dying Christian slave freer than his master." These words that David wrote so long ago are powerful words. They remind us of God's character, of what God is like, and how God seeks to relate to us as we trust in him. And now at this point in his life, David, who once was a shepherd and once was the one who led his sheep to green pastures and beside still waters, now sees his God through this lens as shepherd. God is David's shepherd. And in Psalm 23, David personalizes in such a beautiful way his experience of God's presence in his life. The great Christian pastor and preacher Charles Spurgeon wrote this about David's words in Psalm 23. He writes, "The sweetest word of the whole is that monosyllable, my. He does not say, 'The Lord is the shepherd of the world at large and leadeth forth the multitudes as his flock,' but 'The Lord is my shepherd. And if he be a shepherd to no one else, he is a shepherd to me. He cares for me, watches over me, and preserves me.'" Now, the greater truth is that as God's children, we are part of his great flock. This is not simply an individualistic faith that we practice. And yet at the same time, we're reminded through words like David's in Psalm 23 that God is distinctly aware of each individual sheep that is in his flock. And so it's not wrong to use the word my. It's not wrong for David to personalize his experience with the Good Shepherd. To say, "The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want," that he makes me lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside still waters. God cares for us as individuals. even though we are a part of his great flock, which has many, many sheep that are a part of it. Psalm 23 invites us in that moment of anxiety or fear to go back to a time of God's faithfulness. This is what David's doing. He's going back and using these memories he had of God's presence with him in the wilderness as a shepherd and re-envisioning his relationship with God through this lens. And we too can do the same. As I shared with you, it's my practice in those moments when I feel fear and anxiety overwhelming me, to sit and be still before God and to close my eyes and to go back to those moments in my history when I experienced the presence and the joy of God. To smell the smells and to hear the sounds and to see the sights and to remember that God was there. But even for those of us who can't recall a memory from our own lives where we experienced the power and the beauty of God's presence, we've been given a gift through Psalm 23. This poem that was written by David has been given to you and given to me. This poem is our poem as well. And God invites us through Psalm 23 to make David's imagery our own. So that if you can't recall a moment, a story, a memory in your life that you can go back to and give thanks to God for his presence and faithfulness, you can enter into Psalm 23 and the green pastures and still waters can become your own. And when you go into that place, you can be reminded that God is good, that he is for you, and that he is watching over you. Psalm 23 reminds us that the chaos of this world is not our true home. It reminds us that God has something far greater in store for those who put their hope and their trust in him. He does prepare a table before us in the presence of our enemies. And so that which is causing you to feel fear and anxiety today, it is your enemy, and yet God is preparing a table before you, even in the presence of those sources of fear and anxiety. And I invite you to enter into Psalm 23 and with your holy imagination to place yourself in this setting and experience the presence and the goodness of God who is with you, who watches over you, who desires to lead you to green pastures, who desires to bring you to the still waters where you may drink and have your fill. Jesus is the living water, and when we drink from him, we'll never thirst again as he promised. So may David's words in Psalm 23 bless you and guard you and keep you in the days ahead. May you find your rest in this place where God is present. Go in peace.